Viruses. There's no fossil record of viruses in the conventional sense. They're just too small and fragile to be preserved in rock. But there are fossils of viruses of sorts preserved in the DNA of the host that they've infected, including you. And yeah, I mean, me too, to some extent, I guess. But this molecular fossil trail can help us understand where viruses came from, and how they evolved with the rest of it.
Take the Black Death of the Middle Ages, which wiped out more than a third of the population of Europe, or smallpox, which hitched a ride to the Americas on ships and decimated native people.
There exists on our planet an entire hidden world that has laid dormant for eons. But this world full of strange organisms from prehistoric times is slumbering no more. As global warming threatens the world's ice masses, some scientists have warned that sleeping in that same ice, completely isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, could lurk deadly killers.
Plague, caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. It's transmitted to people when they're bitten by fleas carried by rodents. Most famous for the 14th century outbreak called the Black Death, plague bacteria actually caused 3 different forms of the disease. You've probably heard of the most common one, bubonic plague. It's when these bacteria target the lymphatic system, which helps protect your body from junk like toxins. Between 2 and 6 days later, infected victims get a high fever, headaches, and vomiting. Plus, they get swollen lymph nodes called buboes, which give the plague its name. Bubonic plague causes plenty of damage on its own, but if it's left untreated, it can develop into another form, though these kinds can also occur on their own. If the bacteria infect the bloodstream, it's called septicemic plague. They can cause clots that keep blood from reaching tissues, which turn black as they die. Or if the microbes infect the lungs, it's called pneumonic plague. This can lead to bloody coughs and rapid death, and lets people transmit the plague through tiny droplets in the air.
Europe was hit hard by the plague, but it was not hit first. It was also not unaware of a disease that was already bringing widespread death and destruction elsewhere. Before the infested ships arrived in Sicily, rumors of a frightful sickness devastating the populations of first China and then India, Egypt, Persia, and Syria had spread near and far. While no one knew what caused it or why, it seemed to follow trade routes spanning the Near and Far East. Further, when it appeared, it was by all accounts unstoppable. Those struck by the Black Death would begin to swell at the lymph nodes located in their groin area or underarm regions. The growths would soon develop into large blackish blue egg-sized lumps, or for the even less fortunate, expand to the size of apples. These would then fester and ooze various bodily fluids. Beyond this, those with the disease could develop any combination of a series of additional symptoms. These included fever, pain, chills, sweating, upset stomach, and diarrhea. Almost always, this was followed by
death toll from the coronavirus. More than 3,500 patients have died in Italy, and more than 41,000 are infected.
At first, you might think it's a cold, and it could be. But COVID-19 could escalate. Here's what you need to know. According to the World Health Organization China Joint Mission on COVID-19, as of February 20th, 80% of laboratory-confirmed cases were mild to moderate, 14% were severe, and 6% were critical.
Measles is one of the most contagious diseases we know. Just one person is likely to infect between 12 and 18 people. That number is called a disease's basic reproduction number, or R0. Scientists use it to describe how contagious a disease is. Zika, it has an R0 of up to 6.6, super contagious. But the seasonal flu, just a little over 1. And COVID-19, the disease caused by the coronavirus, just about 2. That difference between the flu and COVID-19 doesn't seem so big, especially when you look at them next to these really contagious diseases. Plus, a lot of the symptoms of the flu and COVID-19 are really similar. A fever, cough, they can even both lead to pneumonia, which is ultimately how they can both be fatal. So thinking of COVID-19 and the flu as similar is a common and frankly understandable comparison to want to make.
In general, they consist of a bit of genetic information, either DNA or RNA, wrapped in a capsule of protein. Many are small, of course, on the order of tens of nanometers, while others are surprisingly big. But they all rely on infecting some sort of host to reproduce and survive. We think that viruses have been around as long as life itself, partly because they can infect all forms of life: bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes. And because they're so simple, some scientists think that they evolved alongside or even before the earliest cells. But without real fossils, how can we know the history of viruses?
Dr. Anderson took me to another part of the facility to show me where the virus came from. Bats gathered in China for food. A vet here captured one, and in a containment cage, she showed it to me.
And why bats? How confident are you that the coronavirus came from bats?
So I'm probably 90% confident that the new coronavirus came from bats.
The initial contamination, she says, likely happened here at a filthy animal market in Wuhan, China. Someone there, she believes, butchered a bat, came into contact with its blood or urine, and then touched his or her mouth or nose.
COVID-19 is a respiratory disease. That means for most patients, the virus will start and end with the lungs. In the early days of infection, the virus invades lung cells. Specifically, this can damage the cilia, the hair-like projections that move around to keep airways clear of mucus and debris. When cells get infected, they die and shed off, adding to the debris and hindering your body's ability to keep stuff out of the lungs and trachea.
There are reasons why this COVID-19 global pandemic appears to represent a deliberate act of bioterrorism. This is occurring at a critical time in the US presidential election cycle. It appears to be worse in males, which has implications for military. This has created a market whiplash. The large pullback in markets represents a tremendous opportunity for investment and wealth redistribution, like 2008 when fortunes were made during that recovery. But is it a deliberate act of bioterrorism? We never know all that goes on. However, the most credible reports are telling us that this new coronavirus was not purposefully manipulated by humans, meaning the virus arose spontaneously from nature. However, it is reasonable to think that this began with an accidental release of COVID-19 from a laboratory that was studying the virus. In that case, human activity is partially to blame.
If it is possible that coronavirus, or COVID-19, is a man-made virus based on a recent review published in Nature, and that's a highly reputable biology journal, not Tree. We can answer the question of if this virus is man-made or not by looking at a few clues. The coronavirus is made up of proteins, just like any other biological thing, and a specific piece of that virus, known as a spike protein, with a receptor binding domain that is used to attach to a receptor found on human cells, known as angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. Once attached, it can affect the cell. That receptor binding domain is made up of a series of amino acids, just like all proteins are made of amino acids. This receptor binding domain is made up of 6 amino acids, of which 5 are different from the first coronavirus to induce panic in the world. Now, I'm telling you all this because it's our first clue. This receptor binding domain has a high affinity for the ACE receptor in human cells, meaning it really likes the receptor and will bind to it often. However, its interaction with the ACE receptor is characterized as not ideal, giving us a clue that it might bind something else better, maybe something non-human. If this were a purposefully created biological weapon, you'd imagine it would be created with an ideal receptor binding domain to be more effective and thereby deadlier. The second clue is in the animals in the Wuhan market, where the virus is believed to have originated. 2 animals in particular, a bat and a pangolin. Bats have a coronavirus of their own that is 96% identical to our coronavirus, but we couldn't have gotten it from bats because the spike protein I mentioned earlier does not attach well to our cells, thereby making viral entry into our cells a no-go. However, pangolins also have a coronavirus, and oddly enough, the pangolin coronavirus does have a similar receptor binding domain. So if these 2 animals were in close contact over and over again, these 2 viruses could have mutated and, in a way, cross-pollinated to form our coronavirus that shares the necessary traits of both to affect humans.
Coronaviruses are common in many species of animals, such as camels, cattle, civet cats, and bats. On occasion, the virus strains mutate and spread from animals to humans. This jump was evident in the case of SARS in 2002, in the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, in 2012, and now in the 2019 novel coronavirus. Two of the earliest patients reportedly worked at the Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market in Wuhan. The suspected ground zero of the outbreak was also dealing in legal and illegal trade and consumption of exotic wildlife.
The cages do not get changed and the poop is allowed to circulate. So you are breeding the ultimate virus that one day will adapt well to the animals that are there, that one day will adapt to the humans that keeps coming in contact. One day the right mutation will happen where the receptor fits nicely well into the humans and in turn allow person-to-person transfer.
Where men failed, nature did little to help either. Not only did people have little idea of how to handle the plague, but they were genetically prone to succumbing to it. Studies of the remains of the European population at the time determined that only 0.2% had a gene that offered them any form of immunity. The other 99.8% had none. Since so many of those who were susceptible to the plague died from it, they did not pass their genes on further to the following generation. Many of those who did have the gene lived on to procreate.